tell you about a few different events that are going to be coming up. A week from tomorrow, we'll be showing the Roaring Twenties at 2 o'clock and be doing a different movie from 1939 every Tuesday after that. So this is our list, and we have several of these around, and also on these sheets, which are out at the desk too, so you can pick them up. But it's the 75th anniversary of a lot of really great books, movies. And on the 24th, a Monday at 6 p.m., we're having Rory Raven, a mentalist and mind bender, come at 6 o'clock. So hopefully you can make it to that. And tonight, we have KateFlora, who's written 14, published 14 mysteries, 2 different mystery series, one with the character of Joe Burgess, and the other with Thea Kozak, and then a couple true crime books, Finding Amy, which was nominated for an Edgar Award, and then also now, Death Dealer. So, thank you for coming. And she is also, or was, the International President for Sisters in Crime. That's right. So, thank you for coming.
Okay, so, there's nothing more terrifying than when you get to some event and they say, you don't mind if we take this for television, because, the minute you put a camera in the room, I think, shouldn't have worn black, should have washed my hair, washed my makeup, and then after about 15 seconds, I start to think, really, who cares? Because we're all here to talk about books, and talking about books, and we're all here to turn off our cell phones, and then we're going to talk about books. So I don't know exactly how it is that I had the very good fortune to get an email from Diana that said, would I come and talk to you all about Death Dealer? But it was really very nice of her, because there's nothing that writers love more than being forced to leave their desks and go out and talk about the thing they love best. And the thing that I love best, of course, is writing and telling stories. And what I like to talk to readers about, particularly when I'm in the nonfiction world, is how it is that I came to write the things that I came to write. Because I started out, like, a lot of people a lot of women, I guess I'd say, of the Nancy Drew generation, believing that what I was supposed to do when I grew up was, to get the job that I couldn't have, which was to go to law school, become a lawyer. And when I decided to stay home with my boys and write books, I of course wanted to write books inspired by Nancy Drew. I wanted to write strong women, amateur detectives who solved things through their own skills and wit and so forth, instead of, the big strong guy jumping out of the closet and saying, I'll save you, dear. So that's where I started my crime writing career. I would say my career in crime, but that sounds so wrong. That's where I started my crime writing career, and I thought that's what I would always do. And then about 6 books into my Thea Kozak series, the New York publisher dropped the series, and suddenly there I was, thinking I'd gone to the show. My career was established. I'd done a book a year, a book a year, a book a year. That was my life now. And suddenly nobody wanted my books. So I had choices to face, choices to make, and what I thought was that, okay, I have sort of 3 choices. I can go back to practicing law, which I loved, but I'd been a writer for quite a while by then. I could go out on 128 and play in traffic because I was feeling extremely depressed. Or I could find a 3rd course, which was taking chances. And taking chances turned out to be the most exciting way to go. So I said, okay, here I am. I've been writing amateur female PIs, strong women books for years. But in the course of writing all of those strong women books, what I have had to do, even though I never thought I had to do it, was spend an awful lot of time with the cops. And spending, because you can't write crime novels unless you know something about police procedure. You can't write a crime novel if you don't know something about a crime scene. You can't write a crime novel unless you know a little bit about investigation, because invariably, even if your character is an amateur, a cop is going to show up. Because that's what happens when you have bodies and crime scenes. So I'd done all kinds of things. I was always running into the police chief's office and saying, Len, can you tell me this? And Len, can you tell me that? Or I would be, I took a Citizens Police Academy so that I would understand police procedure, and I took a self-defense course that the police department gave so that I'd understand something about confrontation and violence. And so when I didn't have another Thea Kozak mystery to write, I said to myself, well, I've spent all this time with the cops. I wondered what it would be like if I started writing cop books. Of course, I sort of knew how to write the strong female character. I had no idea how you go about writing a grouchy 50-year-old guy. I mean, I have one at home, but it wasn't the same. So I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? And so I said, okay, research is always fun because you get to go places and do stuff. So I went to the Portland, Maine Police Department because I decided I wanted to set my stories in Portland. This is the most wonderfully long-winded way of getting to true crime, but it will get there. And so I went to the Portland Police Department, and I had a go-to guy who sort of became my pen pal, and I would ask him questions, and he would answer them. And because his answers were so sort of terse and serious and crisp, I sort of had envisioned him as being, the Godzilla-like formal guy, in the creaky leather jacket who sort of stands back with his arms folded and glares at you, and you become about this tall and assume that he can read your soul and know every bad thing you ever did in your life. So that's what I thought that Lieutenant O'Shaughnessy was going to be like when I got to Portland. He turned out to be a roly-poly, genial, wonderful guy who said, where do you want to go and who do you want to meet? And gave me my tour of the Portland Police Department, and the last place he took me was the Criminal Investigation Division and introduced me to the lieutenant in charge, a guy named Joe Laughlin. And Joe Laughlin came bouncing out of his office, shook my hand vigorously and said, you're a writer, I've always wanted to write. And I knew in that moment, because people who can answer our questions are so important to writers, that I had my go-to guy. I had the guy that I was going to be able to call up and ask stuff because he wanted to call me up and ask how to write. So I became his writing coach, and he became my cop coach. And he was the guy that I could call up and I'd say, hey Joe, it's Kate. He said, what do you need? I said, well, I want to know how to download pornography off somebody's hard drive. Another day it was, Joe, I want to know how to cook methamphetamine, And he would find me an expert, a DEA guy or, their computer forensics guy or their polygraph guy who would sit down with me and walk me through it, so that I could actually write credibly about the kinds of things that were actually happening in my characters' lives. And then a couple, this was, as they say in, Casablanca, at the beginning of a beautiful friendship. But then about 3 years later, when I was working on my Joe Burgess police procedural series, my friend Joe Laughlin had a real murder take place on his watch. A beautiful young woman by the name of Amy St. Laurent went out dancing in Portland one night, and she disappeared. This is Amy. And Amy disappeared, and it became a Portland Police Department and Maine State Police joint investigation because nobody knew what had happened to her. She had simply vanished off the face of the earth. And Joe started saying to me, things are happening in this case that have never happened before in my life. I've been a cop for more than 20 years. Most of the time when you have two police agencies like state police and local police involved in the same investigation, there's all kinds of rivalry, there's all kinds of territorialism, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And in this case, what had happened was that the Maine State Police primary detective and the Portland Police primary detective had done what the cops call marry up. They had become an investigative team. And because they were working together and, everybody else got out of their way. and everything became much easier. And every time they would have a meeting to talk about the facts of the case, or a witness that they talked to, or speculate about what might have happened or where they might want to look for her body, the cops would sit there at the table and someone would throw out a hypothetical, and Danny and Scott Heracles, the Maine State Police detective, would say, "Oh no, our Amy wouldn't do that." And Joe said he'd never seen cops get attached to a victim that way. And actually, I just saw one of the detectives in that case this past weekend, and we were just talking about that. And he said, yeah, he said, we don't do that. We never let them in, because if you get emotionally attached to your cases, if you get emotionally attached to victims, and these things are constantly happening in your life, you just can't do your job. So this was very unusual. And Joe said, I want to write about it. And I'm his writing coach. So I said, okay, here's what you do. You take notes. When something significant happens, you don't have time to write a book right now because you're in the middle of a murder investigation. But when you go home at night, just take 10 minutes and write down stuff that happened today and put it in a folder. And when time has passed and you've sort of gotten this behind you, then you can pull that stuff out and use it to write your book. So he did. He took my advice. It's very rare, but he actually took my advice. He put these things in the folder, and a year later he's still saying to me, someday I want to write about this case. And I got annoyed. Because, by then I'd gotten extremely attached to Amy. I'd gotten extremely interested in the story. I'd been listening and coaching and advising and so one day I thought, I've never done a collaboration. I don't believe in collaboration, really. Writers are very solitary. We like to sort of be in our rooms, in our heads. But what if we do it together? So I called him up and I said, so Joe, what if we write the book together? He said, how would we do that? I said, well, what we would do is we would take all those little pieces that you've been writing down and put in your file, and I would be like the jeweler. I would create the setting, and then we would put those in, like the jewels, and we would have a book. And he said, no. So then I thought about it for a while, and I called him back up, and I said, listen, this is important. It's important to you. It's now become important to me. It's a very interesting story. I'm going to make it really easy for you. You're hardly going to have to do anything. You've already written that stuff. I'll go read the files, I'll interview the detectives, I'll tell the story, and then, we'll put in your stuff. And all you have to do is introduce me to people. And he said, maybe. And finally, after a couple, more cups of coffee and conversation, he said, okay, I really want to do this. I don't know how it's going to happen, but we'll do it. So that was my first foray into the world of true crime. And it was a fascinating story. It was just, it was a story that had all the drama of the best fiction that I could write because of the things that happened and the revelations and the characters who peopled the book, and the long, terrible time when the body was missing and Christmas was coming and her family didn't have closure, and the way that they got attached and who the bad guy was and some of the dramatic things he was doing. And it was a really amazing story. And one of the things that happened in that story was that they couldn't find the body, and they looked and they looked, but they're city cops, and the body was hidden somewhere in the woods. And as hunting season came to an end, a Maine game warden by the name of Pat Dorian, who was the lieutenant in charge of search and rescue for the state of Maine, hunting season being finally over, and he, having read in the newspaper day after day after day about the frustrations of this investigation, and trying to imagine both from the cop side and from the family side how awful it was not to have closure, he came to the cops and said, basically, can we help? Is there something that the warden service, who can organize search and rescue personnel who are used to reading the woods, who are used to looking for lost people, who can, muster cadaver dogs, who can put together a major search operation, and maybe we'll find the body for you. Can we help? And, it was one of those things where first you have two territorial police agencies who were learning to get along, and now you have a third territorial police agency coming into the mix. And, but at this point, the Portland cops and the Maine State Police were so frustrated by their inability to give Amy's family answers and to find Amy, that they said, sure, come help out. So, they organized this huge search operation. It was a December Saturday. Search and rescue volunteers came. Maine State Police dog handlers with their cadaver dogs came. State Police and Portland Police came. And they, and in order to organize this operation, the wardens came in. And you've got the cops kind of sitting there like this, and the wardens come in with their laptops and their mapping programs and their expertise and their boots and their little green clothes, and they sit down at the table and start interviewing the cops. And by the end of the day, the wardens said, we're going to find her. We're pretty confident that, we're going to find her. And then they spent the rest of that day and most of the night driving around places that it was likely the bad guy was going to look, might have dumped a body, places he was familiar with, places that might not have been seen at night, checking out all the possible places they'd learned about from interviewing the cops. And the next morning, they organized this huge search operation. And there was a snowstorm coming. So this was like absolute last possible day of the year when they could conduct a search where they could actually look at the ground. They could see what was good. They could look for things hidden. They could look for dig marks. They could look for all those kinds of things. And at sort of 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with that kind of snow smell in the air that you get when you know it's coming, somebody walking through a field at the end of a road near the suspect's house noticed that a tree branch was buried in the ground, and tree branches don't bury themselves in the ground generally. Got down on his hands and knees, cleared away the pine needles, saw that the sod had been cut, and they brought in the cadaver dogs, and the cadaver dog went to a spot under a tree and then to the spot where the branch was. And they commenced a very elaborate forensic exhumation, and they found the body. So that was Finding Amy, and it was an amazing case to work on. And part of what I had to do in order to tell that story was to talk not simply to the Portland police and the family and the Maine State Police, but also to go talk to the wardens. How did you put the search together? How did you make your decision to get involved? What was that day like? How do you map one of these things? How do you organize a major search with 50 or 60 people? All of those kinds of questions. And when we finally had a book launch for Amy, I'm standing in a hotel ballroom with all of the characters from my book, except for the bad guy who's in prison, and Amy, of course, who's no longer with us, but mother, father, sister, boyfriend, cops, lawyers who tried the case, and the wardens. And one of the wardens, Pat Dorian, the guy who'd organized that search, looked at me. At this point in my life, I had decided that I was never writing another true crime as long as I lived. A book takes me 9 months to a year. I'm in control. I may have to go do research. I may have to go ask some questions. But basically, I make up the characters so I can make them behave the way I want. This Finding Amy took 2.5 years because there was, a trial and then an appeal, and you had to wait for the appeal to be decided, and the Maine State Police wouldn't talk to me, so I couldn't even finish my interviews until, the appeal was decided and the conviction was upheld. So I, interview, wait, interview, wait, and then finally, 2.5 years later, the book was done. But I wasn't doing that again, because 2.5 years is a lot of time to spend thinking about somebody who's real, who died, in the way that I had to write Amy's story. So I was done with that. I was going back to Joe Burgess, people where you can control what happens and where they go, and, I understand fiction and fictional people. So Pat Dorian is there at the party, and he's had a couple of drinks, and he sort of grabs me by the arm and pulls me off into a corner, and he says, "So Kate, when you're ready, I've got another one for you." And I said, no, Pat, no, not doing it anymore. It's too hard. He said, "Well, I'm here if you want to talk about it." And about a year later, I thought, I love writing fiction. I really do. It's wonderful. It's so exciting to create a world that's so compelling and so peopled with characters that you want to spend time with. that you will go there and be lost in my books, because that's what, good reading is for me, and I hope that that's what good writing is for you. And I just love it. But I realized that there's also something really fascinating about having people trust you enough to tell you the truth and let you into their lives and let you into their stories. That's a real, if you can do it, if you can win the trust, and particularly of law enforcement people, because they're naturally suspicious. There's, people are always abusing them and lying to them, and so they have a natural kind of us versus them stance. And I am very clearly a civilian. Or as I said to somebody recently, it's really been a hard life. I've been blonde for 65 years. I mean, who's ever going to take me serious? But it's it's a real gift and it's a real honor when people will let you help tell the story. And so I called Pat Dorian up and I said, just give me a little sort of inkling about what this story is. And he starts to tell me about the story, and it's very interesting. And then I said, okay, so where was the body found? Miramichi, New Brunswick. Well, Miramichi, New Brunswick is not close. Miramichi, New Brunswick is essentially one of those places that if you decide you want to go there, you get in your car and you drive, and you drive, and you drive. And you drive until you can't drive another foot because you're exhausted and you're sick of staring at trees. And then you drive a few more hours and you're there. So that's, sort of where it was. But, having opened the door, I said, oh, okay, so here's my next excuse. I said, so Pat, will you talk to these people, these cops up in Miramichi, and ask them if they're willing to talk to me? Do they want a book about their story? And if so, are they willing to give me the same kind of access that I had in Portland, which was really very much a sort of a anything you want, anybody you want to talk to, anything you want to read, anything you want to see kind of access. The primary detective gave me a copy of his daily notes, all those things in his little notebook. And I sat in the breathalyzer room in the Portland Police Department week after week, reading files, reading interviews, and then going and sitting down with the detectives and saying, tell me about this and tell me about that. So the Miramichi police said, sure, we'd love to have her come up. We'd love to talk about this story. This was really a very unusual case for us. Once again, cops say that there's one case in your lifetime that really sticks with you, and particularly, small city cops, people who aren't dealing with horrific crime all the time. These are the standouts. These are the cases that they will live with forever. So they wanted the story told, so they said, come on up. So I drove to the end of the earth, and then 2.5 hours longer, and got to Miramichi, and started getting the story. And the story basically, goes something like this. There's a couple, David and Maria Tanasechuk, and David Tanasechuk is known to the cops, as a very violent, very bad guy. He's the kind of guy that you always are kind of keeping an eye on. He's sort of known to sell drugs. He has convictions for illegal weapons. He's a guy who at one point in his history had been, was facing a prohibited weapons charge, and in order to make the cops back off and not, prosecute him, he had hidden a gun in the woods and he was going to kill the prosecutor, the judge, and one of the police officers. So he was not a nice man. But at the time that the story begins, this not very nice man and his wife Maria had recently had a changed relationship with the Miramichi police, and that changed relationship came about because Maria's son had been murdered. He'd been killed at one of those kids back to school in the fall parties out in the woods, and he was kicked to death, and so the relationship between David and Maria, who'd always been suspicious of the police and had nothing to do with authority, had changed because the police were now dealing with David and Maria as the parents of a crime victim. And that's a very different relationship for the police. That's a take care of the family, keep the family informed, sort of see the family through the court process. And in this case, that was sort of enhanced, or there was an underpinning of urgency to paying attention to this family because of David's history of violence, because there was always the risk that if David wasn't watched carefully, he might take it into his head to go and kill the killer, because that would have been David's way of dealing with life. You know, I know how to handle things. I'll get a gun and I'll fix it. So, at the point that the story begins, it's a January day. There's a massive snowstorm going on. I think it's a Sunday afternoon. And David Tamasechuk calls the Miramichi police and says that he's very worried about his wife Maria, who is missing. And she and he were having some marital difficulties, he said, and they decided to spend a little bit of time apart, and she said she would go down to St. John to spend some time with a friend, and she would be in touch with him in a week and see how things were going. And it had now been 10 days, and he hadn't heard from her, and he was getting worried. A perfectly reasonable thing, but of course, you know, police officers, when it's a domestic situation and the wife goes missing, what's the first thing that you think?
Husband.
You think we'd better take a look at the husband. And at least the husband is the best witness for all of the information. What day was she last seen? What did she take with her? What's the name of the person that she went to see? What's the phone number? What's the address? How, how did she get there? Who else might she go to see? All of those, sort of obvious questions you'd ask if somebody disappeared. When were they last seen? So the police set about trying to talk to David Tamasechuk. And for the next 3 days, somehow or other, they can't quite pin him down. Brian Cummings, the detective, goes to the house, and David is there, and David is sort of out of it. David is not very functional. And so they make an arrangement that, and it turns out David has had problems with drugs in the past. And everybody that police talk to say, well, David has been slipping farther and farther back into drug use. And at the same time, Maria has been trying very hard to keep him from using drugs, and done, all sorts of things, told drug dealers up and down the river, don't sell to him. And Maria loved David more than anything in the whole world, and she believed that if she could kick her drug habit, which she'd done years before, that with her help, David could too. And so she's trying to save David, who doesn't want to be saved. And as a result of his going in the direction of more increasing drug use and lies and spending all their money on drugs, and Maria's increasingly frantic efforts to stop him from doing this and to save their marriage and to save her husband, their marriage has been significantly frayed. And when the cops go out to the street and start interviewing people, the first thing they learn is that the rumor on the street is that something bad has happened to Maria, but there's no sign of her. And so the case is underway. So I, talk to the cops, listen to their story, decide it's a pretty interesting story, go back to Massachusetts, call up an agent in New York whose name I've been given, who is, specializes in true crime. And I say, I've been given his name, we've been introduced, I tell him my story about, the cops up in Miramichi and this bad guy and, all the interesting things that happened. And he says, there's no one in the world who's going to be interested in reading about a small Canadian crime. If I were you, I wouldn't bother to write this book. Well, that's all I really needed. Tell me that I should not do something that I've now become convinced is valuable, interesting, important. I've now met these people. They've begun to sort of open up to me. They're beginning to tell me stories. They're beginning to sort of bring me into their world. And these people are so nice. It's kind of like, it's not just they'll sort of talk to me. It's like they'll sort of talk to me, and then they'll sort of invite me to dinner, and then we'll all sort of go drinking. And then, I'll go back to my hotel, and the next day I'm sitting in my room working, and there are rocks being thrown against my room, the window of my room, and they're standing down there with dinner on a plate because they're worried about me. And these are just really nice people. And,
Yes.
and as they begin to tell me, the story, the real, the story that goes deeper and deeper. What I learn is that not only is there sort of an interesting, murder investigation because they're investigating a guy who is very hard to get. You can't conduct surveillance on him because it's a small town, it's the middle of winter, he's nocturnal, he wanders the woods in the middle of the night. He has a three-wheeler, like an ATV kind of thing, and he just goes driving into the woods. He has his friends drive him into the woods and then drop him off, and the car drives out, and he's not there, and they don't know where he is. And then, because he has been unable to, through his lies and charm, convince the cops to back off and leave him alone, he's just an innocent, worried husband, he decides that the way to make the cops back off is similar to the plan that he had with the prosecutor, the judge, and so forth. He is going to attack their families. And so now, conducting surveillance becomes that much more important. And every time the phone rings while they're interviewing a witness, or they're somewhere else, or they're doing some other piece of police business, they're thinking, oh my gosh, it's my wife and she's gonna call and say, come at once, he's here. And so, the tables are turned. They're stalking the bad guy, and the bad guy is stalking them. And so and they have no body. I forgot to say, they have no body, right? They know Maria is missing. They're certain that Maria is dead because everything, is a departure from her normal life behavior. But they have no body. And, if we have woods here, they have woods, and snowmobile trails and logging trails and, everything. And they have no body. And they look, and they look. So now their investigation is always two things. One is, can they find anybody that David has talked to? Can they find a weapon? Can they find the murder site? Can they find anything? On the one hand, and the other is, where in the woods is Maria? Where can we look? And they realize that the day that he called up, why did he call 10 days after she disappeared? Because there hadn't been any snow. And there would be tracks, there would be the body, and so he was waiting for a day when snow had come down and everything was covered up. Fascinating kind of story. So 7 years later, I came into this after the first trial, and started getting the story and going back and getting more of the story. There was one day when I sort of said, a couple things that I really want to do, and one of the things I really want to do is I want to see where out in the woods the body was, and you can only get there through ATVs. So Brian, my cop, backs the four-wheeler out of the police garage. Then he backs a second four-wheeler out of the police garage and hands me a helmet. I've never driven one of those things. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. And there I am sitting in the police department parking lot with this big helmet and this machine, and away we go. I always think it's really wonderful when I think that they've trusted me a little too much. They think I'm actually a lot more capable than I think I am, and then I prove that I am actually that capable, and that's kind of exciting. So that's Jet Stealer. Except, of course, we haven't said anything about dogs or bodies or any of that stuff, really. So eventually they managed to arrest David and put him in jail for a gun charge. A gun charge that happens because he's hiding in the trunk of a car with a gun on his way to one of their houses. So David is off the street, but he's only off the street for a few years, and they know that if he gets out, being a vengeful sort, he will come after them. So they really, really need to find Maria's body, but they've exhausted everything that they can think of. And they finally decide that what they need are cadaver dogs. They need somebody to come, dogs and handler teams to help them search the woods around Miramichi. They search in Canada, and they find one dog and handler team in, I think it's Ontario somewhere, which will fly to Miramichi if they can have first-class tickets. But one dog and one handler really isn't going to do a whole lot of good. So then they decide to look over in the States. They decide to come to neighboring, states and see if there's any help that they can get from America. So they start in Connecticut with a guy who is, sort of one of the sort of founders of a lot of the cadaver dog training for search dogs. And he sends them to Maine, and eventually the trail of phone calls sends them to Pat Dorian, because Pat Dorian is your go-to guy. He believes that this is an incredible resource and that it should be used. And he and the police chief up in Miramichi talk, and first thing he says is, you don't have to worry right now because she's frozen. You know, we can't search right now because she's frozen, but nothing else is going to happen either because she's frozen. The challenge is going to be to hit the right point in the spring when the body is giving off scent, but before the bear have come out of hibernation. Yeah, I mean, this is really this book is just one sort of race against time after another after another. So finally, spring comes, and you know, the wardens have gotten permission to come from Maine up to Canada, sort of an international cooperation thing. Volunteers from an organization in Maine called Maine Search and Rescue Dogs, MESARD, some of their trainers, handlers, and dogs are going up to help with the search. And finally, it's May, they go up. The woods are full of water, the woods are full of mosquitoes. They walk, 10 or 15 miles a day. It's wet. One of the wardens, the warden who ultimately found the body, a woman named Debbie Pullman, said she was changing her boots and her socks 3 times a day just to keep her feet from blistering so badly she couldn't walk. And they walk, but it's still, and scent is of course carried by wind, and it's hot, and it's wet, and there's still snow in the hollows. Every single solitary condition, which makes it very difficult to conduct, scent searches. And after 3 days, they come home and leave the Miramichi police saying to themselves, sort of, where are we going to move when David gets out of jail? Because we know he's going to kill us. But Pat Dorian, the world's biggest optimist, says, we'll be back. Don't worry, we'll find her. And a month later, they come back, and the conditions for searching are even worse. It's 95 degrees, it's horrible, the woods are so full of mosquitoes you can't see, and out they go, and they search, early in the morning and late in the afternoon, and on the third day, when the mapping experts are reading all of the maps, then they've uploaded from their GPSs everything that they've covered, so they know the terrain that's been covered and cleared. They see a hole in the mapping, a place where there aren't any roads and any trails. And they say, this is where we haven't looked. And it's within the area that we've decided is where he's most likely to have put a body. And they send Debbie out with her dog, Alex. This is Alex's stand-in. I carry it because if you look at the cover of Death Dealer, you'll see that there's a totally adorable black lab. There were some adorable labs on that search, and they're wonderful search and rescue dogs. But the dog that found Maria was Alex, and he was a German Shepherd. So Alex comes with me so that he can be fairly represented. And that, they found her. And so then, and it was just, it was just an amazing moment. Because the wardens and the searchers didn't know until afterwards the stresses, how much this mattered to the cops. They knew it mattered because cops are investigators. They didn't know it mattered because it felt like life and death. They didn't know how big the threat was. They didn't know how emotionally invested they were until the end. And then they realized how much had ridden on those searches and how important it was that they finally found the body. So there was a trial, there was an appeal, there was a trial, there was an appeal, and it was literally 7 years before there was final justice for Maria. And it was only 7 years later, because she turned out to have been shot in the head, that her skull was actually buried with the rest of her body. So, it's not, some of these details are not nice, but the storytelling is kind of riveting. The facts, how they put it together, how they didn't give up, how people persist in the face of so much frustration and so much, and fear for their families. Those are the kinds of things that a lot of times police officers will just let it drop because it's too hard, because you've hit brick wall after brick wall after brick wall. But they were not going to fail to get justice for Maria, and in the end they did. So I'm really glad that I didn't listen to that agent in New York, because I think he was wrong. I think that regular people's stories matter, and I think that regular everyday cops who are heroic and brave in the face of awful things and who believe in justice for victims matter. And I believe that storytelling matters, and so it's all here. And, you know, I have my other new baby with me, which is the fourth Joe Burgess, just because, you know, you never go anywhere without your children, especially when they're just born. So, questions, comments, thoughts, quarrels, quibbles?
In the write-up here, it says serial killer.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So what they discovered when they were first investigating this case, because one of the things they were trying to figure out is David and Maria were very much in love. David and Maria were really a tight couple. What was it that caused that bond to fray? Well, what caused the bond to fray was the drug use. You know, he was absent as a partner. He had, you know, and that terrified her on a number of fronts. But what they discovered by talking to her best friend was that, because they were trying to figure out, okay, you know, they're not getting along anymore, so what? You know, David's moved on before, why doesn't David just leave? Or why doesn't Maria just leave? Well, Maria wouldn't leave the house because it was where she had the shrine to her dead son. It's where she'd always lived with him, you know, and she was such a homebody, she wouldn't leave the house anyway. But why didn't David just leave? Well, the reason David didn't just leave is that this wasn't David's first homicide.
Wow.
He hasn't been convicted of others, but there are probably 2 others that he has committed. And so they weren't looking at not that a domestic homicide is a minor thing, but they weren't looking just at a domestic homicide. They were looking at a serial killer. They were looking at somebody who, this was probably his 3rd murder. And why did he murder Maria? Because if their marriage fell apart, she was the keeper of his secrets. She was the person who knew what he had done. And as long as they were together and he was the love of her life, she would keep his secrets. But if they weren't together, then she might not. And so that's why. That's what's serial killer. He was. The others, you know, they haven't convicted him of them. They're still looking. I mean, the first person who disappeared, I think, was Maria's brother, and they're still looking for his body. And they may have found a first burial site, but not a second burial site. But they've never given up, and that's 15 years ago. They're still looking, and they're still keeping the pressure on, and they're still hoping that. I mean, one of the things they're hoping, quite frankly, is that one day he will come to Jesus and he will feel a need to get right with the world, or he will, you know, be dying and he'll feel a need to be right with the world, and maybe he will confess. But the one person to whom he has confessed is the person that he killed. So.
Do you ever get to meet the people, the real?
The bad guys?
Yeah.
I didn't meet him. I was in the courtroom, and he was in the courtroom. And I figured that was plenty. You know, and even then I wasn't feeling particularly safe because his lawyer was extremely careless. He was in a, you know, sort of like a plexiglass box, and he had petitioned the judge. He had a very aggressive lawyer at the second trial, a lawyer who terrified Maria's friends, who were these really simple people. And they had already come into court once and been terrified and testified against him, and he'd gotten off, you know, he'd gotten a new trial, and they're coming back into court facing the possibility that he might get off, and then he's got this lawyer who's very aggressive and down their throats and calling them liars and, you know, picking up on tiny little inconsistencies in their stories, and so going into court for them was terrifying. And David had asked that he be able to be at the trial without handcuffs on. And the Miramichi police and the court officer's position was absolutely no way. You know, not unless I sit there with a gun in my hand during the entire trial, and that, you know, probably won't look any better than, you know, he can keep his hands down. But no, but his lawyer would run in and out and leave the door unlocked. And that scared the heck out of me, and I'm sure it scared the heck out of everybody, else who knew what he was. And the judge who was trying the case didn't know who he was. She didn't know the history, because you can't bring that up. So, there's the cops sitting, every single morning during the trial, and the trial went on for weeks, and there was a voir dire that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks before that, the Miramichi police would send 2 cops with shotguns and a dog up to the prison, and even though the prison van transported him down to the courthouse, they would follow it to make sure. And there was one point when they were coming up on the second trial when they got a call from the prison that David was feeling unwell and they were taking him to the hospital. And one of the people that David admired very much, perhaps one of David's heroes, was another Miramichi resident. This is a small town. This is like, 19,000 people or something. But there had been a Miramichi resident some years before, a guy whose name was, oh dear, I'm not going to be able to remember his name. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, he was a guy who had committed a murder and was in prison and made an excuse to go to the hospital and escape and killed 5 more people. And he was known as the monster of Miramichi. And for a while, the whole town's nickname in that part of Canada was Murder Michi, because, when they have a murder, they have a murder. And so, so when David said he needed to go to the hospital, the, prison guards were just taking him to the hospital, and the Miramichi police are thinking, Alan Legere, we are not having this happen again. So they scramble a car and the guys with the shotguns and the German Shepherd over to the hospital, and David gets out of the van and he takes a look at them and he says, "Take me back." So clearly he wasn't feeling especially safe. He was looking for a chance to escape.
What do you think of that you can't look into the background of the person?
Well, those of us who...
I think it'll have it changed.
No, I don't. I think that's the American system of justice, and evidently the Canadian system. And the Canadian system's even, stricter in a lot of ways about what you can say and do, and what, the standards of evidence and how you put in testimony in and things like that. It's just how it is, but it's troubling to those of us who, I would hate to be on a jury that didn't have that kind of information, and then, after the trial's over and you've acquitted somebody, find out that it was the 4th time that this guy had been.
Well, I don't think you have to worry about being on a jury.
I had been on a jury, but it was just a stupid jury. It wasn't. It was a returnable bottles fight. But yes, I've been on a jury. I never thought they'd let me be on a jury.
Yeah.
But you'd think I'd have every, I write books with the cops,
But you were a lawyer.
And I was a lawyer, yeah. So, but it's just how it is. Other questions? Surely you have questions. What could be more fun than having your very own writer to ask hard questions of? Like, do you write in the morning or in the afternoon? And how many hours a day? Do you write only when the fluttery little muse lands on your shoulder? Or, do you actually get up and go to work every day? And,
Do you write every day?
I do write every day when I'm not doing this. And running conferences and coaching other writers and teaching at Grub Street in Boston and washing my husband's underwear and making sure he has chicken. Because, it's terrible when you have a wife who sort of says, "No, I'm not going to be home for dinner again tonight, dear." But there's pot roast and there's chicken and there's hamburgers and there's...
Are you writing another book now?
Yeah, I am. Well, actually, I'm just about to. I finished a book that is... There are 3 answers to that question. One is, I'm waiting for the edits from my editor for the Thea for spring. I just made a deal with my publisher to do the 5th Joe Burgess, even though I said I would only write 4, because I'm not ready to give him up yet, because I love him and so does everybody else. And I have just finished something that's really, really interesting too, which is another one of those please don't come to me and tell me you've got a story you need help with books, where there's a warden, a main game warden named Roger Gay, and Roger was on, his dog was actually the dog that, sort of identified this is the grave site and this is where the body was before it was buried in Finding Amy, and somebody that I was on the search for Maria, though he wasn't the one who found the body, and he called me up one day and he said, "Really like what you did in Finding Amy, and I've just retired after 25 years with the Maine Warden Service, and I have always been told that I have good stories to tell, and I don't know how to do it. So I said, well, let's just talk. And at that point, I needed to just talk with him because I was finishing up the dog part of Death Dealer, and I really needed more dog lore. I really didn't understand enough about their training. I'd been on trainings, but I didn't understand enough about organizing the searches and what they're looking for and what the actual kind of physical on-the-groundness was. And so I said, we'll talk, and we'll see if you have a story and you can help me with my book. And so we talked, and after 3 hours I said, yeah, he's got a story. And I thought it was going to be a cute story. I thought it was going to be a, like a, what we started out calling it was James Harriet with guns. Because it's all, it's all in the woods, and it's all animals, and, some of the animal stories are sad, and some of them are scary, and some of them are funny. But as I talked to him and as I spent more time with him, I realized that what he was really telling the story about was a life arc in which it sort of started out with the devotion to fish and game, but it turned out that even protecting fish and wildlife meant you were in a population, in a world where everybody carries a gun. So that every confrontation that you have, every interview that you conduct, every person that you walk up to is armed. And then I realized that, his life had sort of gone from straight fish and game enforcement, which he loved, which is what got him into it, to what we call off-road traffic cop, which is as, snowmobiles, ski-doos, with those, all the different sort of motorized craft begin to infiltrate the woods. They're the cops who deal with it. Accidents and people going through the ice and people, speeding in the woods and all kinds of, stuff. And that then he got into search and rescue because people are always getting lost in the woods, and that the search and rescue stories became dog search and rescue stories, became cadaver dog stories because they realized that you had to train your dogs to look for people whether they were alive or whether they were dead. And then it became cadaver dog stories helping out cops in homicides. So it went from sort of a cute story to a really complicated life that had all of these dramatic things happening in it, and ended up with Katrina and looking for body parts and so forth in New Orleans, and then a massive case of PTSD and a sort of a reflection on the whole of what that life was about. So I said yes to vignettes and ended up writing a very serious, very powerful book with this guy, which we are now trying to sell, and fingers crossed. Again, nobody's going to be interested in that story. No one's going to be interested in the amazing things that the dogs can do, that the wardens do, what the life is really like, how we actually have to protect wildlife. I mean, this is just one thing after another that I've learned, and I guess the reason I don't say no is that I learned so much. It's just amazing opportunity to, sit with people and have them just keep opening up. I mean, to have people open up about PTSD, especially when they're public safety people, is a really big deal. And when I went up to Miramichi to deliver the books, when the book came out, to deliver the copies of Death Dealer, because I really wanted to give Death Dealer to the cops myself because of all the time we'd spent together and the confidence that they placed in me. I learned that my primary detective that I worked with had actually had PTSD years later and hadn't realized what was happening until his wife said to him, "You've got to go get help." And it was only through that he realized what had happened to him. And so that's what I'm working on. I'm going to start a new book next week.
Do you write more than one book at a time?
No, not usually. Sometimes I'll edit, a book that's been sitting around for a while, so I'll do writing in the morning and editing in the afternoon. But mostly I believe that I kind of have to inhabit the story because, these are very complicated stories. When I write something fiction like And Grant You Peace, which, is the new Joe Burgess, there's so much to this book. And, and I have to remember every time I sit down, where I left all the threads, who's going where, which of my 3 detectives is talking to who and what they're going to bring back and how that's going to have an impact on the story that I'm telling and what direction it's going to send the narrative and so forth. And then, even with fiction, I'm weaving, the investigation with the family story. So it's complicated.
Do you use
As
other?
a public, since you've been published, right, you don't have to self-publish no more.
Well, I've never self-published. But,
Okay. Do you find it easier to find a?
No, it's you reinvent yourself every single time. I mean,
Okay.
yes, I can sell another Joe Burgess because they're successful and my publisher loves them. But the true crimes, each one is a standalone story. And so I have to keep going out and finding somebody to do that. And, I don't know what's going to happen with the Warden's story. The New York publishers seem to think that it's too small a story for a national stage. And I don't agree with them. I think that if they marketed it right, it's a story that lots and lots of people are going to be fascinated by. But, I have to keep working at this. You don't relax, you're never done. I think that I just keep reinventing myself and reinventing stories. And who knows? I mean, right now my standard joke is that I went to my first talk for Death Dealer, and one of the wardens came in and sat in the back of the room. I looked at him and I said, "Kevin, don't you dare say to me, Kate, I've got a story for you." And he said, "Well, Kate," he said, "what about Jerry Largay?" And Jerry Largay's the woman who went hiking on the Appalachian Trail and disappeared. And I said, "Kevin, I don't want to hear it." But you never know. I mean, I just met a guy this past weekend whose father was a Boston cop who worked on the Boston Strangler story. And he has all his notes and all his crime scene sketches and all his reports. And it, could be just an absolutely dynamite book. Because it's different. It's the person who was hands-on, who was there. And I didn't even know until I talked to him that the Strangler went to prison for assault, but never for any of the murders. No one was ever tried for those murders. So there's always going to be another story. You had a question.
No, I was going to say, when you're working on a series, I think, do you get so engrossed in the book that you you're living it and you don't have to remind yourself what happened in the last book when you're writing the next book, or do you have to refresh your memory?
Sometimes it depends on how long it's been. Like when I just did Thea after a number of years. And there were two things that went on. One is that it was like getting together with old friends, like people you knew really well but you hadn't seen for a while, and you wanted to catch up. What's going on with them, what's happened in their lives, how are they getting along, what's going on the work front. I usually, before I start a book, I will read through the series and see everything that's happened up to that point to remind myself, sort of where I left them all. I did this Burgess pretty recently, so I don't know how much I'm going to have to refresh myself about Joe's life. I certainly know where I left them, which is with, an awful lot of stuff that needs to be resolved in the next book.
See you next
And yet,
Wednesday.
the mystery's done, so.
So they should be read in order.
They don't have to be,
Yeah,
it's always nice to read them in order, but on the other hand, we write them, to solve a mystery. I mean, people, years ago, I didn't know that this was something you were supposed to do if you were a fiction writer, but years ago I was giving a library talk, and somebody said to me, "So, what do you want me to take away from your book?" And I thought, it's just fiction, it's entertainment. What do I want you to take away from it? And then, since then, when I'm writing them, I'm thinking, what do I want you to take away? And what I would want you to take away from Ed Grant You Peace, which is a book about traditional cops who've always lived in a sort of a white, it's a white Protestant Catholic city. And suddenly it's a city that's full of, motorcycle gangs and Cambodian immigrants and Somali immigrants and Sudanese immigrants and communities that you don't know your way around, and communities that come with, embedded suspicions of authority and a lack of, we don't cooperate, and clan structures and all of these things. And I wanted to explore what's it like for somebody who's, sort of traditional, bent on justice, good cop, good at his job, when he comes up against, these very different situations that he has to go into and still interview and be effective. And I really wanted to explore sort of, culture clashes and what's that like for him. And it was a really interesting experience. Yeah.
What do you read yourself?
That's a great question. Because of course I don't have any time to read. Right now I'm reading for a contest, and there are 60 books, and I have to read them. I teach writing, and I consult for people, so I'm reading their work constantly and saying, here's how you do this and here's how you do that, and so I have to read my friends' books, and I have a lot of friends who write. I just read Craig Johnson. It was my first. The guy who writes Longmire, because he was a guest of honor at this mystery conference we had this past weekend, and loved them. I mean, a very Tony Hillerman, and I loved Tony Hillerman more than anything. I thought the best thing in my life practically was getting to interview Tony Hillerman. The night that I got to sit on stage and do a one-on-one with Hillerman, I went home, and at 3 o'clock in the morning I was still lying there grinning, saying, I could die now. It was that wonderful. So I guess I like medium boiled. I don't like serial killer stuff very much unless it's really, really good. I mean, I think that Michael Connelly is great.
I thought the
Yeah.
fact that you write true crime
Yeah.
also,
I think that Robert Crace is good. I've always liked Jeff Parker. I know that Hallie Efron writes really great suspense, and so does Hank Phillippe Ryan, But it sort of depends in some ways on what I read last. Because that's the book that'll be in my head, and right now that is Craig Johnson. Oh, and and then I read lots of new writers. We have a main crime writers blog, and so I'm often interviewing somebody for the blog and introducing them to readers, and so I want to be reading their stuff. And then I read my friends. I read Lee Waite, who writes a really lovely series set in Maine, and her character is an antique prince dealer, and they're not super cozy. They're just traditional. And my friend Caitlin Dunnett, who is also Kathy Lynn Emerson, who is also Kate Emerson, who has written 50 books, everything that she writes is excellent. And it's wonderful to read books where you don't know what's happening and you like the characters and you're just swept along and you can be confident that it will be really well done. And I like that. I think we all do. What do you read?
Everything.
I read a lot of mystery writers. I read Connelly, probably my second favorite writer. I like Lee Child.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah.
I think Lee Child.
I read all of his
I think
books.
those Reachers, my husband and I say you can only read Jack Reacher in the car. And, because, they've got that kind of pacing and and they're so improbable. But he's such a lovely man.
Oh, isn't it?
And I read Grisham.
Yeah. I
Do
often-
you have anything on audio?
Do I? Yeah. The first two, Burgess, I think it's just the first two are on audio. And then I have a book that I wrote under a pseudonym years ago as Catherine Clark called Steal Away, which is a suspense thriller, which is about a kidnapped child. And that is an audio book. But not a lot, enough to get you going.
Yeah.
When you're writing the true crime, do you ever ask not to use real names and things? Is that a problem?
In the first one, I wrote it with a cop. He wasn't worried. My publisher wasn't worried. Death Dealer, they were so worried that my standard joke about Death Dealer is that I have not one but 5 releases from every human being that ever had anything to do with the story. I have the photo relief, I have the life story release, I have the maybe you said something bad about me and I don't care release, and then I have the release that says, even God isn't going to be mad at you release. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, they were so picky. And I would say to them, this name is in the trial transcript. This name she testified in open court. This person's in the appellate decision. Her name is everywhere. Well, we're not going to use it. So I just said, okay. After a while I got so tired of calling people up and asking them for releases, I was ready to say, nobody's going to be interested in a small Canadian crime, including me. So, yeah.
But don't you, if it's a true story, don't you have to use the correct names?
Well, you can just say a neighbor or a friend, her best friend, her, It's
Coincidence.
No, I mean, you make them, they had a disclaimer in the front of the book, I think, that said that I was using composites or something, and I said, there are no composites here. You know, so.
Did anyone ever come back at you?
I'm sure that if Dave ever gets at it, he'll kill me. And, you know, and Maria's sister, who's not in the book, was very cross, but Maria's other sister said, you know, Betty doesn't want to be involved in any of this. And she wasn't at the trial, and I hadn't talked to her, and now Betty is emailing me, and, you know. And there were so many people who, after the book came out, were sort of asking all these questions. I finally put the cops on. You know, I mean, I just said to Brian, you deal with it. You're so charming, and I'm so anxious. You just go deal. And that worked really well.
We have a book club that meets on the first Wednesday of the month in the morning. It's a mystery book club. If we were to read one of your books, would you come the Wednesday that we're talking about
Oh
it?
yeah, because I love it when people have read the
You hear
books.
that, Diana?
Oh, it was a decision whether we had to come for this or book club.
But you know, one thing
Well, why
that's
not the
really,
book club too?
it's fascinating to hear what people, you know. I mean, I went to a book club when Finding Amy came out, and you know, and we had our usual discussion, and then one of them started to giggle, and she said, "So I want to know." The victim's mother's name was Diane, and she was a real hot ticket. And Joe Laughlin, my co-writer, was a real hot ticket. And she giggled and she said, "So, did Joe have a thing for Diane?" Joe had a thing for every woman in Portland.
Well,
I think so too.
Okay.
Do you
Whatever.
have an email address?
I
or-
do. I have a website, which is kateflora.com. That one's really easy. You email me through the website. There's a form there so that you can just come and talk to me. Unless the emails might be on the handout. I'm
It
not
is.
Yeah,
sure.
it
Your
that-
email, your Twitter.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
it
anyway,
is,
Twitter,
it
you
is,
know,
yeah.
I'm at KateFlora. It's KateFlora@gmail. I'm really easy to find. Probably a little too easy.
You might want to reconsider
But
that.
all I can say is that I have a lot of friends who are cops, and they're very scary.
Where do you reside? Are you local?
I can't tell you, can I? Because the bad people
Yeah.
coming after me, you'll have to figure it out. You're all good detectives.
Yes.
Are we all set?
Let's get it home and finish it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm selling books for thousands of dollars. These are 25, and then I hate to say, this is what the publisher charges me. They don't give these
That's right.
books.
No, they.
So, and I can take credit cards, and Finding Amy is 8. And I have Joe Burgess's in paperback,
Yes.
some of which I brought, so. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
We could listen to you all night.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about this next book.